Breaking the Envelope, an Afropessimist approach to Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing is the first film where Spike Lee doubles as director and as the main character. Through Mookie's character, the audience gets a glimpse for a day of a block in Brooklyn. The block is Lee's fantasy of Brooklyn, or in psychoanalytical terms, an envelope or wrapping. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott explains the envelope as a space created for safety between the internal and external, and between fantasy and reality, or in this case, insanity. Once opened, the envelope breaks and reality flows in. In other words, the envelope is the subject's fantasy of what he/she internalizes as reality from childhood. However, once the envelope is opened, the fantasy is broken, and an external reality takes over. Lee creates the envelope of what he calls the People's Republic of Brooklyn because the envelope keeps the insanity of the reality of police brutality and white supremacy outside and allows for the block's social development. However, once white civil society invades the block, the envelope breaks and disappears. Lee films the movie through Mookie's eyes and his interactions with several stereotyped and unique characters, like the mayor, Booging Out, Radio Rahim, Mother Sister, Smiley, and Mr. Senor Love Daddy. We also get glimpses of the threat of police, outsiders crossing through the block, and of the block as a character in itself. These interactions form Mookie's envelope. Through Mookie's eyes, we feel the familiarity of the characters because he's lived there his entire life, and in turn, he has created this envelope of how he sees his neighborhood from his childhood. For most of the film, Lee portrays the neighborhood in a vacuum, where black civil society thrives. However, the Wall of Fame in Sal's Pizzeria is the source of the film's trouble, because it showcases Italian celebrities only, even though they're in a black neighborhood. Bugging Out demands Sal to hang some pictures of black celebrities, and his refusal leads to the boycott of the pizzeria. The Wall of Fame is a reminder of what Frantz Fanon describes as absolute and structural violence, not as black condition, but as black life. In other words, even though they're in a black neighborhood, the Wall of Fame becomes a reminder of the lack of recognition for black success. The Wall of Fame is a form of structural and representational violence because it highlights black bodies' repression in the US. Moreover, the Wall of Fame is a window of the world beyond the block, and it begins to open the envelope. The envelope opens completely through spectacular white violence toward black bodies in the murder of Radio Rahim. The role of spectacular violence in breaking the envelope is discussed in the chapter The Narcissistic Slave by Frank Wilderson. He mentions that from an Afro-pessimistic perspective, attention to spectacle makes us think of violence as contingent of symbolic transgression rather than as a matrix producing black death and white civil society. In that line of thought, I argue that through both structural and white spectacular violence, Mookie's envelope breaks and it falls in line with the matrix producing black death and white civil society. However, most of the focus of the criticism on the film is in the scene when Mookie breaks the window that leads to the riot, not in the murder of Radio Rahim. This showcases how society normalizes violence against black bodies as symbolic, instead of violence to create direct repression towards the black community to preserve white civil society. Mookie's envelope opens in the climax of the film, which begins when Radio Rahim and Bugging Out come into the pizzeria at the end of the day with the boombox, playing Public Enemy's Fight the Power to demand black celebrities to be on the Wall of Fame. This act challenges white civil society structure where white people impose imagery on black people. Sal's reaction is violent, destroying with a bat the boombox and calling the cops. Yet the violence is not surprising necessarily. When the cops show up, they kill Radio Rahim in a chokehold, which is outraging yet normalized. The murder opens Mookie's envelope because the violent act is so transgressive that he can't hide from the insane reality. He looks tired, upset, and outraged. Mookie externalizes the outrage he's been hiding the entire film in what critics see as the actual transgressive moment. Mookie calmly walks back, takes the trash out of the trash can, picks it up, and breaks the pizzeria's window. The scene is transgressive because, as Wilderson points out, that for blacks, violence is a matrix of impossibility, a paradigm of ontology as opposed to a performance that is contingent on symbolic transgressions. For that reason, neither the murder of Radio Rahim nor the violent reaction to the riot by the police are as transgressive as Mookie breaking the window, because that transgression is symbolic and done by a black man. In contrast, the transgressions perpetrated by white society are normalized. Mookie's envelope is not a perfect fantasy, but the fantasy that he internalizes from childhood. For example, the police's role through the film is a constant presence and threat to peace. The police uniform is a form of structural violence because it directly contrasts and threatens African Americans. Their presence is threatening in the way that police spectacle is not the effect of the racial uniform, rather is the police uniform that is producing re-racialization. Martinon and Sexton, 56. The police officers in the film are white, careless, angry, cynical, and cruel, even when they defend the people in the block, like in the fire hydrant scene. Their presence is threatening because their role is to maintain white civil society, even when it means taking away black life. The use of derogatory language also opens the envelope. The scene when all the characters rant against characters from other races or ethnicities is a prime example of how language perpetuates the structural violence and the matrix of violence that produces black death. Martinon and Sexton describe it as derogatory terms do not mean, they assault. Their intention is not to communicate but to harm. Thus, they are not discursive signs or linguistic statements, but modes of aggression. When Sal destroys the boombox, he verbally attacks Radio Rahim, first with the N-word, calls his music jungle music, and uses derogatory language in general to impose superiority over Radio Rahim. While the relationship between Sal and everyone seems to be decent before this, the use of the N-word and the derogatory terms effectively breaks the envelope, and Sal becomes part of the oppressive force. By opening the envelope, there's a fundamental change in Mookie's character. After the murder of Radio Rahim, Mookie looks around and sees the other character from a different perspective. The mayor is not lecturing everyone, but is trying to save Sal and his family from the riot. Mother Sister is enraged, yelling to burn down the pizzeria. Smiley embraces violence and sets fire to the pizzeria. Mookie is a character that creates the envelope, and when the envelope is opened, he can finally see his neighbors as more than stereotypes. Moreover, by being outside the envelope, Mookie can challenge the status quo. He can finally fight back, even if his transgressions become merely symbolic. So even though the matrix of violence remains, and violence against black bodies is normalized, outside the envelope, Mookie can finally decide to challenge it. David S. Marriott discusses the normalization of violence against black bodies in his article Frantz Fanon's War. He discusses how white civil society condemns black existence, and by reflecting it in the screen, it causes an internal struggle in the black person. He analyzes it through Fanon's experience watching Tarzan. For Fanon, the screen becomes one way in which a culture can reflect, can make apparent its unconscious fantasies. Mookie's coming of age comes from releasing the anger that has been built by the experience of constantly seeing and listening to violence against black bodies. In several of his interactions through the film, Mookie has to either be the moral conscious, calm down his friends, and in many ways restrains his violent impulses to keep the peace between the pizzeria and the neighborhood. Similarly, Spike Lee is a black filmmaker that had to resist the structural violence in NYU of being shown Birth of a Nation without mention of the social implication and almost got kicked out of NYU for making a film against it. Through his career as a black filmmaker, Spike Lee has to navigate white civil society and restrain himself. The matrix of violence, in the form of police violence or racial violence on screen, is perpetrated purposefully to destroy fantasies of a better reality for black society and to reinstate white civil order. Both Mookie and Spike Lee have justified internalized anger against white civil society, and both decide to fight back. Therefore, the scene where Mookie breaks a window is how Spike Lee reflects his unconscious fantasies on the screen, and for Mookie to grow up by fighting the violent structure that has been set upon him.
Mook man, I see you walking down the block. Go on home to your kid. Now, the news and weather. Our mayor has commissioned the Blue Ribbon Panel, and I quote, to get to the bottom of last night's disturbance. The city of New York will not let property be destroyed by anyone, end quote. His honor plans to visit our block today. Maybe he should hook up with our own, the mayor, buy him a beer. Your love daddy says, register to vote. The election is coming up. There's no end in sight from this heat wave, so today the cash money word is chill. That's right, CHILL. When you hear chill, call in at 555-LO.